Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Omar, and I'm an assistant professor in Arabic and Islamic Studies here at Georgetown University. I'd like to welcome you to our new series where you get to meet the scholars and hear them discuss their intellectual journeys. My guest today is Dr. Marcia Inhorn, professor of anthropology and international affairs at Yale University. You can find her full biography on this page. Dr. Inhorn, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, I'm so pleased to be here, and I thank you for inviting me to do this with you.
Thank you. So I'd like to start by having you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to your specific areas of research. I think sometimes we forget the humans behind the writing, and so this is sort of an opportunity for us to get to know you a little better.
Yeah, thank you. It's fun to talk about one's path in life and sort of how it started. Yeah, I am a little different from a lot of other Middle East studies scholars in that my training is in anthropology and specifically a subfield called medical anthropology. I was in college, a journalism and anthropology double major, and I worked as a journalist for a while. But then when I went back to graduate school at University of California, Berkeley, I went there because of its medical anthropology program. And medical anthropologists are basically cultural anthropologists who are interested in living humans, health and illness and suffering and sort of the, illness journeys of people living around the world. And when I got there, it all started, the Middle East part of it started because I was invited as a, budding medical anthropologist to participate in a project on blinding eye disease in rural Egypt called trachoma. That's actually where I started. And I lived in a small Egyptian village with another medical anthropologist sort of studying, how people were experiencing this sad disease of blindness. But what I learned there in talking to young women is that infertility, not being able to have a child, was a very difficult situation to be in for women. It was very stigmatizing, and the expectation was that when you marry, you should have children pretty much right away. And at that time, this was in a village outside of Alexandria, Egypt, and the University of Alexandria Hospital, the public maternity hospital in Alexandria, the second largest city in Egypt, was opening an infertility clinic for the poor, for the Egyptian poor, a public effort to bring infertility care to the poor. So that's where I got permission to do my dissertation research. And, I worked in this public maternity hospital. It was the first public hospital in Egypt to bring in vitro fertilization or test tube babies to the public sector in Egypt. And so that's how it started. I ended up working with mostly poor urban Egyptian women who were having great difficulty having children in a society and in a part of the world, I'm going to say, that is very child-centric, very pronatalist. Most people are married. Most people want to have children. Most people, love children. And so the expectation, especially for women, is that you get pregnant and have children. And if you can't do it, it's sort of a social disaster. It can cause real marital problems with your in-laws, problems with, family life. And so infertility is where I started. And I've stayed all of these years because looking at, infertility and fertility is what I call a social lens. It's a repro lens into so many other areas of social life, religion, religious expectations, family life, the economy, how people have money to go to healthcare, medicine, what people do in the sort of Western medical sector, what they do outside of the Western medical sector, relationships with family, with, marital relationships, why people believe they're sick, their illness journeys. And so that was where it started. And then with the entrance of in vitro fertilization into Egypt, Egypt was the first country in the Middle East to bring IVF in 1986, which was only about 8 years after the world's first test tube baby was born. Egypt opened its first IVF clinic. And, so by the mid-1990s, IVF was just booming in Egypt and then eventually in most other countries in the Middle Eastern region. So ever since then, I have been literally following each new assisted reproductive technology around the Muslim Middle Eastern world. I started with IVF. I did another study of IVF in the private sector in Cairo in the mid-1990s, and then in the early 2000s, I went to Lebanon, where I studied. There's a technology especially designed to overcome male infertility, which nobody talks about, but there's a lot of male infertility in the Middle Eastern region, and a technology called ICSI. So I did a study of men and their experiences with infertility and ICSI technology. And then I went to the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, and I did a study in Dubai, the big global city, of people traveling from all over the world trying to get high quality IVF services in a global Middle Eastern city. That was very interesting. I met people from 50 different countries traveling into Dubai to try to access, IVF and infertility care. And then I used to be a professor at the University of Michigan, and in Michigan, as Dr. Omar knows, is in the Detroit area. It's the largest Arab ethnic enclave in North America. There are many, many people from a variety of Middle Eastern countries living in Detroit and its suburbs. And so for 5 years when I was at the University of Michigan, I would go back and forth to an Arab-serving IVF clinic in Dearborn, Michigan, right outside of Detroit. And I met, in that particular study, a lot of men and women who had fled from war zones in the Middle East, including Iraqis who had come to the U.S. as refugees. And so I ended up doing a study of really war refugees, not only from Iraq, but people who had fled from Lebanon, from southern Lebanon during its civil war, and the struggles that they were having, in the U.S. to try to get access to good infertility treatment services, leaving countries that were really devastated by war and coming to this country and really not being able to access healthcare services in this country because it's so expensive. So I kind of define my career, if you will, as a medical anthropologist, as traveling with these new technologies as they keep coming out, traveling with them to interesting sites within the Middle Eastern Muslim world. And that sort of defined my career. And I can talk a little bit more about how Islam has been really important to these studies. And that's something that eventually I ended up spending a lot of time thinking about as well.
So it sounds like, it sounds like you've given us a snapshot of a single sort of issue or topic that you've looked at across geographic lines and international lines. But I also know that you've written widely on a number of different topics and issues, including masculinities, gender and health, science and technology, religion and bioethics, globalization and global health, biomedicine and ethnomedicine, stigma and human suffering, and the health costs of conflict, especially for refugees and forced migrants. So given the breadth of your scholarship, I guess, what type of questions have you asked over the course of your career, and how have these questions shifted and evolved over time?
Yeah, and so, again, going back to this notion of just taking a single medical condition and seeing it as a lens into social worlds, that's really what happened for me. Infertility was the topic, but it led me into many other realms: gender, how women sort of define their lives, how men define their personhood and their masculinity, and looking at medicine and bioethics, all of these things that you've just described. And so I've gone deeply into really all of these different issues. That's what's happened to me. I've really become a Middle East gender studies scholar because I've worked so much on, reproduction. What does that mean for women? Why is motherhood so important? Why are children valued so much? And it's not just for women. Men's lives are also defined by fatherhood in the region, and, being able to have a patriline that goes back to your father and your grandfather, and to keep that going. And what happens if you can't do that? It's very devastating. And so, through this topic, I've really spent a lot of time thinking about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a couple, a married couple. And this is one of the things I think that, in a way, I've done somewhat uniquely, something that's been a very different about the kind of work I do. In Middle East gender studies, in anthropology, for example, we talk with women, and then, men talk with men, but there's really been a huge gender divide where women scholars have gone off to work with women in the region. Male scholars work with men, but often not about masculinity. They're talking about other issues, tribalism, poetry, economy, things that, men's work, not about how they feel as men. And so there was really very little work being done in sort of Middle Eastern masculinity, if you will, by scholars. And, there was an assumption, I think, going on that women couldn't work and talk to Middle Eastern men, work with them as interlocutors, and vice versa, that men couldn't talk to women. And so we have a gender divide going on in sort of contemporary scholarship. And I was convinced of that myself. I realized that male infertility, problems of spermatozoa, were really serious in this region of the world, and that somebody needed to really talk to men who were facing male infertility. I tried to convince a male graduate student to go off and do a study, and I was unsuccessful. One of my colleagues, an Arab, scholar who's in North America, a professor in North America, said, "No, you should go do this. Why are you assuming that you can't talk to men about this very sensitive, source of male suffering?" And so he kind of convinced me I should try. I put in grant proposals. I was successful. I ended up going to Lebanon and ended up doing a huge study of masculinity in the face of male infertility in Lebanon with men from across the sort of multi-sectarian landscape. It was not only Lebanese men from, Muslim, Christian, Druze. It was also Palestinian men and Syrian men who were sometimes traveling to Lebanon to get services. And so I ended up writing this book. I think it's one of my proudest sort of achievements as an academic, a book called The New Arab Man, Emergent Masculinities, Technologies, and Islam in the Middle East. And it talks about, talk about humanizing scholars. For me, it ended up being a humanizing endeavor simply because I met with so much humanity among the more than 200 men that I did long, in-depth kind of life history interviews with, about their lives, what they'd gone through, and, told me about their dreams, their hopes, their marriages, their families, their desires for fatherhood. Many of them had been through horrific war situations and, what they'd gone through, their war stories. And so I ended up writing a book that talks about masculinity in the Arab world and what I'm calling emergent masculinities, that men are really thinking about how they want to be as men, how they want to live in this world, and that really notions of manhood are changing, that they're dynamic, they're in flux, they're generationally different. They changed after the 2011 Arab uprisings. Young men took to the streets. They wanted dignity. They wanted something different from their, in their life worlds. And so that book really tries to capture all that was sort of new and changing and reflexive, that men were thinking and critiquing and, wanting to have new futures as men in the Middle East. And so that book, ended up being an important book, I think, in that regard. And I think that when people read it, they feel like, wow, it has many stories of men's lives. And actually all of my work does. I really believe that, in a way, I'm in a privileged position as an anthropologist, collecting people's stories, very intimate stories that they've shared with me, that as an anthropologist, we have an ethical obligation to really share those stories with the world. I mean, it's actually part of our AAA Code of Ethics, is that if people talk to you and share with you their lives, you have an obligation to reciprocate by writing. And so that's what I've tried to do, which is why I've ended up publishing 6 books at this point from all of these years. It's been many years. I've been doing it for a long time. But it's been 30 years of research and 6 books that I've written and a number of edited volumes as well.
But just as a quick follow-up to this and a final question, as the fields have changed, and maybe in your situation as technologies have changed, and having written over 30 years of your career, in what ways have you had to alter or change your methods or approaches or theories or any of that as you addressed some of these questions and topics?
Yeah, the one thing that I'm going to say, honestly, I was never trained, unlike you, I was never trained in this as an Islamic Studies scholar. I was educated about Islam as a religion, but I never had official training. But in my world of IVF and ICSI and many other technologies that are related to assisted reproduction, there's been so much Islamic debate and ethical reflection and discourse and fatwas. And so I've had to sort of become an expert in those, in this area. I know a lot. I've had to learn a lot, and I've had to, read fatwas, and I've had to look at there are real differences in Sunni and Shia perspectives on these technologies. And it's been a massive learning experience for me, and something that I've really, it was not something that I anticipated, but it happened, that when you're making human life through a technology, religion matters, not only on the level of sort of official authoritative discourses, it really matters on the individual level. People want to know that they're doing something correctly. So I'm going to say that that's one thing that, as I was entering this world, I had to learn a great deal. It's not something that I could have anticipated, I think, going in. And then the other thing that has happened, obviously, is that so much political violence, so much war, so much devastation has happened in the 21st century in the Middle Eastern region. And much of that devastation is because of the United States and its horrific wars in both Afghanistan, a war that is still going on. It's the longest war in U.S. history. And, Iraq too, the U.S. led a war in Iraq starting in 2003 based on false intelligence. And one can say that it really wasn't a legitimate war, but it really caused incredible devastation in the country of Iraq. And, and then we've had the uprisings this last decade. We've seen the Syrian civil war. There's a war going on in the Gulf. There's a war going on in Libya. The region is really unsettled, and there's a lot of incredibly tragic violence and death and destruction. And so again, that's not where I started. I started in Egypt, which really hasn't had a war per se in many, many years. But I worked in Lebanon, and that's where my eyes were first opened to what war does to people's lives. And then coming back to Michigan and working in the United States with people who had come over as official refugees, or they had fled as, asylees, they were fleeing war, that too became something that has really mattered to me, to look at political violence, to ask how the U.S. has created political violence, and to really question and challenge what is the moral obligation of the United States to care for those people whose lives it has upended. What is the moral obligation of the U.S. to take care of Arab refugees? And I think it's something that Euro-American nations are grappling with, because in 2015 we saw the beginning of the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And today it's even worse. There are 80 million forcibly displaced people in the world, and the majority in Europe and in North America are from the three Middle Eastern countries of Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So I care a lot about that. And I've written a book. My last book was called America's Arab Refugees, Vulnerability and Help on the Margins. And again, I'm really proud of that book. It's a critical book. It's really a book I wish more Americans would read, to just remind us what our own government did in the region in the 21st century, and that we have a moral obligation to care for people. And that's really the main message of that book. So again, I didn't start there, but that was the last, the last place. And the current projects that I have going on, I've got these 3 edited volumes coming out next year. One on Arab masculinities. They're all co-edited, by the way, but one's going to be called Arab Masculinities. And then I have a book coming out with another colleague called Unsettling Middle Eastern Refugees, Regimes of Exclusion and Inclusion in the Middle East, Europe, and North America, looking both at the ways that Arab refugees have been excluded from many societies where they've fled, but also there's some wonderful examples in this book of people caring, welcoming, and doing their best to include, Arab refugees into their societies. So that's sort of the current project.
Wow, that's, you've shared so many different paths and journeys, and I truly appreciate that. So thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your intellectual journey. And thank you to everyone else who's listening.
Oh, thank you so much. And we had the great pleasure of having you with us here at Yale University. And we're so happy to see that you've gone on to Georgetown. And thank you for inviting me to your Georgetown community.
It's
Thanks.
our pleasure. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.